All right, hi everybody. Welcome to day 4 of NCHB's conference. Today's topic is affordable housing, and this session is on federal resources for affordable housing. So I hope you guys are in the right place, and we thank you guys for coming back and joining us today. A couple of things before we jump into the presentation. Everybody is muted, but you can use the questions box. In the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a control panel to send in feedback, comments, questions. We'll save about 15 minutes at the very end for Q&A. So yeah, please send in your thoughts throughout. All sessions are being recorded, and we're going to send out slides and a video tomorrow morning. You guys should be receiving your daily conference email, which has a recap of the previous day's sessions, and will also include the slides and recording from today. One last thing, the poll that pops up at the end of the session, please feel free to give us any sort of feedback you'd like. This helps us plan for future conferences and adjust where needed. So yeah, thank you to our panelists for joining us today and sharing your stories and sharing your thoughts on this topic. We really appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into presentations.
Great. I believe I'll kick this off. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Cho. I'm Senior Advisor to Secretary Fudge at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, focused on housing and services. Among my duties and responsibilities to advise the Secretary on the work that we are doing across HUD to support efforts to end homelessness, especially and including veteran homelessness. What I want to do today is really just talk a little bit about where we see the current outlook with regard to our efforts to end veteran homelessness, and why we are at a point where we know we can't address and end veteran homelessness without actually adding to the stock of affordable housing that's available to veterans. Let me say this, earlier this year, we released our report from the 2020 point in time count, and what that showed was that veteran homelessness was virtually unchanged from the prior year. In fact, it has remained relatively flat over the last 4 years. That's in contrast to the steep declines that we've seen in veteran homelessness from 2010 to 2016. From 2010 to 2015, veteran homelessness declined by an average of about 10% every year. In 2015 to 2016, we saw a 17%, a really unprecedented level of decline in veteran homelessness. Much of that progress was achieved through the investments made in programs like HUD-VASH, the supportive services for veteran families, and other interventions that are really about helping veterans to find, connect to housing, but really primarily through leasing, leasing existing apartments on the private market, helping veterans to connect quickly as possible. And we've been highly successful in that. Over the last few years, the level of investments have continued. We've seen expansions of HUD-VASH. We have now 100,000 or so HUD-VASH vouchers nationally. I believe VA spends roughly $700 million in homeless programs, and so we have pretty significant resources, and yet we're seeing a flattening and a stalling of our progress in reducing veteran homelessness further. Based on the recognition that progress has stalled, Secretary Fudge and Secretary McDonough at VA jointly issued a statement in April recommitting the agencies, HUD and VA, to working aggressively to reduce veteran homelessness. And that includes providing the direct leadership at the secretarial level, where they plan to meet on a regular basis to really review our progress and to ensure that they are sending a signal across all federal staff that we must work with urgency to troubleshoot challenges. Now, we're identifying a number of challenges that we're seeing to making further progress in reducing homelessness. And among those is the challenges that we're seeing with regard to our ability to find available vacant units on the private market. One instance of that is in our HUD-VASH program, where right now HUD-VASH utilization, which is one of the measures that we look at, is hovering in the kind of mid to high 70th percentile. That's in pretty sharp contrast to back in the 2010 to 2016 period, where HUD-VASH utilization was in the high 80s, almost at 95% at one point. And so we've seen HUD-VASH utilization decline. We've also been looking at the number of housing placements through HUD-VASH, through SSVF and other programs, and we've seen that relative to the number of new veterans who are falling into homelessness, the number of veterans that are being connected to permanent housing is also declining. In 2015 to 2016, about roughly 2/3 of the veterans who were newly identified coming to VA for new homelessness assessments were actually rehoused. So about 2/3 of the people were rehoused that relative to that came in. That's now down to about 60%. So all that means, I think, we're looking at a number of reasons why, but one of the reasons that we know is because there are just limited vacancies in the rental market, and certainly COVID has affected our ability to find housing. So we know that our progress to reduce veteran homelessness further needs to also address the stock issues, the supply of affordable housing. And so one of the things that we are looking at is how do we, in addition to providing rental assistance, which is critical, also add to the stock of affordable housing. Fortunately, through the American Rescue Plan, HUD has now allocated about $5 billion in grants to communities through a program called the Home Investments Partnerships Program. Now, the HOME program typically funds capital, but is not necessarily focused on homelessness. In the American Rescue Plan, $5 billion was added to that program with a specific focus on creating new affordable and supportive housing that can serve people experiencing homelessness, including veterans. So we've made the allocations of those funds. We're working now to provide guidance to communities on how to use those funds. They actually have quite a bit of flexible uses. Communities can use the $5 billion in home funds for tenant-based rental assistance. They can also use it for supportive services. But what we hope is that communities will use the vast majority of those funds to add to the stock of affordable and supportive housing. Home funds typically do not provide sort of one-stop shopping. It's not like you can necessarily develop housing. And historically, communities that have had home grants, which usually go to cities and states, layer that financing with other sources. So one strategy that we believe is effective is if communities can use private capital, if they can use state and local funds. One of the sources also in the American Rescue Plan through the Department of Treasury was $350 billion in state and local relief funds. Those are highly flexible funds. So if communities can begin doing the work to acquire properties, to do pre-development work, site work, architectural, environmental assessments of properties, they can begin adding new projects to the pipeline and use the home dollars, the $5 billion in home dollars that we've awarded, aligned with other capital sources, including low-income housing tax credits, including trust fund dollars, including state capital resources, to create packages of permanent financing that can ultimately serve as the long-term financing for projects. So that is what we're hoping to see. We estimate that those $5 billion in home funds, with the leveraging and layering of other funds, could ultimately create something like 25,000 new units of affordable and supportive housing in the next several years. And so we're hoping that communities can work with urgency. One strategy is to secure kind of set-asides in the projects that are developed for veterans. Some communities are looking at their existing low-income housing tax credit production pipeline and saying if there's affordable housing developments that we could further subsidize using home grants, we can create set-aside units within larger affordable housing developments that are specifically targeted at homeless households, including formerly homeless veterans. So more to come. We'll have more guidance and technical assistance resources in the future. I'll also say you have an administration here recognizing that we need to make investments in affordable housing across the board. And so in the American Jobs Plan, President Biden has asked for over $200 billion in additional investments in affordable housing programs. There are some discussions happening as we speak regarding the infrastructure package and whether some of the housing provisions will be included in that. We're waiting to hear. But needless to say, this administration will find various ways to ensure that we are investing in a variety of different programs that can help finance new affordable and supportive housing, including to address our nation's crisis of homelessness among veterans. So with that, I'll leave it there.
Hi, I'm Steve Culbertson. I'm the Deputy Director of San Francisco Programs and Housing Development at Swords to Plowshares. I have a background in affordable housing development. I lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for many years, and we effectively ended veteran homelessness in 2015. I moved to the Bay 4 years ago, and I'm working at Swords to Plowshares to effectively end veteran homelessness in San Francisco and Alameda counties in the Bay Area. I work extensively with Supportive Services for Veteran Families program. And then, of course, we're doing affordable housing development, which I'll talk about today. I wanted to give Peter a chance to introduce himself, and then I will move on with my presentation.
Thanks, Steve. 25-year career in affordable housing and housing authorities. Have been an active developer both in New York and now in California. And as you have two guys from California on this panel that can tell you that we are sort of ground zero with many of the challenges that Richard talked about. So excited to be here. Thank you.
Next slide, please. There we go. So we have a project that was completed last year in San Francisco, the Edwin M. Lee Apartments. This project is 119 units of affordable housing, 62 units for veterans, 57 for family units. We do development at Swords to Plowshares with a nonprofit partner, Chinatown Community Development Corporation. We work on these projects collaboratively. They handle more of the development. We handle the property management and supportive services for veterans. So as you'll see, most of the units at this project are one bedrooms, and then for families, and there are some studios, and there are also some 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms for families. What we find is that veterans prefer and have need for more studios and 1 bedrooms. Occasionally we see a veteran family, but it's rare. Next slide, please. This particular project, the Ed Lee Apartments, was built around an inner courtyard. It's beautifully landscaped, and honestly, anyone that goes to visit this project wants to live there, no matter what your income is. Next slide, please. So a breakdown of the project is that we get a bond from California. We get loans from the city of San Francisco. We had some AHP money, that's Affordable Housing Program, from the Federal Home Loan Bank. We have the VHHP program, so that's money set aside in California for veterans housing to try and address the needs of veterans, and particularly homeless veterans in the state of California. A small deferred developer's fee, and then, as you'll see at the very end, the capital contribution from the limited partner of $30 million for a total of $76 million. Again, this project is a total of 119 units. And so for those of you doing the math, that's $641,000 per unit. That's a big price tag. And I would say that Peter and I were talking yesterday, we started calling it the layer cake of all these sources of funding. It actually becomes rather expensive to put together all of these various sources into the layer cake that we make. And it's not just a chocolate cake with chocolate icing. It's like actually chocolate and strawberry and raspberry and hazelnut and all of these different flavors into the layer cake. And so you'll hear me advocate later for a single source of funding, like a 202 or an 811 back in the day, for veteran housing. So we also have to put together a layer cake of operating subsidies. So HUD-VASH is one component of that. We also get funding from the city of San Francisco. And this is common, that we actually have to put together yet another layer cake of subsidies to try and make the project work and make it affordable for low-income people, and particularly for homeless veterans. Next slide, please. So our project currently under development, and as I said, the Edwin Lee Apartments are completed. We now have veterans living there, and lives have been changed, quite honestly, by the projects that we develop, and people are living in beautiful new apartments and feel like they've won the lottery. So on Treasure Island, which is a man-made island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, that used to be a military base. We are involved currently in a redevelopment plan for the island. And as you can see, the Museo May Apartments, which is the project that we're working on, is that tiny little apartment under the blue arrow, and then there'll be a bunch of high rises all around us. At the moment, it is the single project that's under construction on the island, and folks are going to have straight across from that blue arrow is the city of San Francisco. So folks are going to have an amazing view for a little while, and then they're going to get other buildings built in front of them. Next slide, please. We work closely with the architects to design these projects. They're state-of-the-art, using sustainable technology to build them. In the case of Museo May, we're built using modular construction to build the project. Next slide, please. Again, build around a single courtyard. It'll be 105 units for veterans and homeless veterans and formerly homeless veterans. We actually have a number of units on the island, on Treasure Island right now. Those units need to be raised because the entire island is being raised to deal with the sea level rise. So the whole of Treasure Island is being raised X amount of feet. And so those other units will have to be torn down, and those folks will move into this project. Next slide, please. Again, about a $75 million price tag. The layer cake, as I talked about earlier, the bond issue, the San Francisco loan. We've got VHHP money. You can see that's a significant amount of money into the deal. Thank you, California, for setting aside that money. Swords actively advocated for that money to be set aside in California. Strongly encourage and can work with any of you in your states to try and get similar money set aside for veterans. And then finally, the tax credits, again, generating a lot of the revenue for the project. And the other layer cake, the annual operating income. Again, we've got HUD-VASH units, we've got HUD-VASH project-based units. These are all separate applications. There's a lot of work. And I would add, there are legal fees for the tax credits that, like there's an awful lot of other money that's not going to affordable housing that has to be put into the deal in order to use the tax credits. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about direct federal funding for veteran affordable housing. Richard spoke earlier, and I'm just going to outline these, and then I think we'll get into more of a discussion. But I've used home dollars that Richard was talking about earlier in other deals, and I'm not actually sure of what the source of the funding is from the city of San Francisco right now. It may be home, or it may not be. But without a set aside of dollars specifically for homeless veterans, I think that it's going to get lost in the sauce. And so I would encourage Secretary Fudge and Secretary McDonough to work together to set aside part of that home money for ending veteran homelessness as a set aside. Secondly, wanted to make a comment about senior housing. We have a lot of aging veterans, and my executive director, Michael Blecker, is somewhere around, and he is an expert on this particular topic. But Swords has made it a commitment over its very long history since 1974 to serve senior veterans and to really emphasize the needs of senior veterans. And for those veterans, we really need very, very rich supportive services, and want to advocate for additional services for senior vets. And then corollary to that is what I would call HUD-VASH Plus. So currently, if you're not aware, many of us who are in the field know what HUD-VASH is, but it's sort of this combination of operating subsidy that comes from HUD, and then the VA provides supportive services. And so we are using HUD-VASH, at least in San Francisco, and I would say in Philadelphia when I was there, to provide for the needs of very, very distressed human beings who are veterans who have suffered from PTSD. And it's a little bit of a mismatch, right? Case management alone does not actually meet the needs fully for this population, whether they are seniors or whether they are suffering from mental illness and addiction. And I would advocate for what I call HUD-VASH Plus, which would be HUD-VASH, and then additional medical, mental health services wraparound for each individual that's in HUD-VASH. So a much richer services and supportive services base for the population. I'm going to be quiet for a little while, turn it over to my compatriot Peter, and I'll be back. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. You know, a lot of similarities in our projects. Interestingly, the Central Valley in California, you know, suffers for, you know, obviously some of the same conditions. While we have lower population, proportionately, I think we have comparable numbers in terms of homelessness. But as we kind of had a chance to dialogue about yesterday, San Francisco is a fairly affluent, or one of the most affluent communities, candidly, in the country. You know, has much by the way of local resources to help, you know, mitigate veterans homelessness and homelessness in general. Communities in San Joaquin County, Stockton is the major city in San Joaquin County, that rely exclusively on the federal entitlements of home, CDBG, ESG, and you know, our hands are out for veterans projects along with every other affordable need in population. That special needs projects compete, you know, with just straight affordable, and there's tremendous need in California for simple affordability. There's, I think there's, the last statistic I heard is there's over 25,000 rent burdened families in San Joaquin County, population of about 750,000 people. So in terms of households, I mean, there are many, many working folks that fall into homelessness simply based on the affordability, and veterans projects get in line with that crush of affordability. So, you know, just by way of some statistics in San Joaquin County on veterans homelessness, a June 17th snapshot, 461 vets served in homelessness programs countywide on that week. 102 unsheltered vets contacted through street outreach on that same week. 17 vets in transitional programs, which is like a 6 to 24 month transitional housing program, 10 of whom are over 62, and a handful of them are in the 35 to 44 range. So there's a substantial population, both young and old. Our VASH numbers, we talked about VASH. So, you know, typically VASH programs are administered by housing authorities in the jurisdiction that nonprofits and affordable developers work. We do receive initial allocations of VASH that are set aside, then they start to roll into our regular affordable programs, and our numbers are struggling. Stockton has had a 29% increase in rents in the last 5 years, and the math on the way these programs work, as each voucher becomes more expensive, we serve less families because our programs lag the market. You know, before there was some, you know, sort of cap on rent increases in California, I mean, there would be year-to-year rent increases that were simply unsustainable, and it's super challenging to catch the market. So these programs essentially have to sort of chase these rent increases where landlords can pick and choose, you know, who they rent to. So special needs population like homeless veterans, people are making business decisions based on their rental properties. It's a challenge. So our numbers, our success rates, you know, continue to drop. Currently, we have 259 VASH vouchers allocated for the county. 140 are currently leased, with 33 currently either searching for an apartment or in the eligibility process. And you know, we're starting to have an honest conversation with the jurisdictions in our county that to say, this is a tenant-based program. People can use that voucher in a private rental, but leasing incentives and wraparound dollars to get people into private apartments are required. I mean, we're just not able to meet the market, and that's a conversation we're having locally. But to Richard's point, if the tenant-based programs are not getting the penetration in the rental market that makes this program successful, we need to stand up buildings. So Victory Gardens is a collaboration with the County of San Joaquin and the Housing Authority of the County of San Joaquin to use existing county land to build a 48-unit homeless veterans project with 43 of the units being HUD-VASH and 5 of the units being regular project-based vouchers for non-VASH eligible vets. So we're super excited. This project has broken ground, and we have, as I said, a geographic hole. There's There's veterans projects in Sacramento. There are veterans projects in Alameda County, which is adjacent. But there isn't probably dedicated veterans housing. There's a few units in San Joaquin County, but this is not going to meet the need exclusively of the 102 folks that are housing unstable right now that are struggling, but this is going to help get us there. So next slide, please. We've mobilized and we started construction beginning of April, and we're obviously hoping for faster than an 18-month construction. But what is unique about this project, and Steve and I had a chance to to discuss our operating as it relates to the rental subsidies. I mean, while there is an operating reserve that comes from the state of California through VHHP, these projects do not make money. These services are deep. We have people that come in and can maintain housing stability, and then we have people that come in and need deeper support than what simply rents will provide. But what is unique about our project is smack about half a mile away is a Veterans Administration community benefit outpatient clinic that's currently under construction, 180,000 square feet. In addition, there's I think it's called a CLC, a community living center, which is a 120-bed nursing home. So, we're trying to leverage the geography here of having a county hospital and a VA clinic that is all within, half a mile of Victory Gardens. And, as we contemplate doing this type of development, and as Steve will attest, I mean, the Housing Authority makes construction guarantees, we make operating guarantees. I mean, we put money at risk to build these projects. We feel that we have an automatic relationship to veterans as the VASH administrator locally. We want to see these monies flow to California and to San Joaquin County. So with the county stepping forward with a 75-year ground lease, that counts as leverage towards our project. There is home CDBG funds. We were able, because of the donated land and local entitlement funds, to be competitive with VHHP. Just by way of statistics and this layer cake of state and federal resources, you need one to get the other. That it's the initial seed money from the federal entitlements that allow us to compete favorably in California. I want to say in the 4 rounds of VHHP, which is about $350 million, this is the first award of $6.8 million coming to San Joaquin County. So we look at it on a per capita basis. There should have been multiple projects. We're 2% of the state's population, and we're finally getting an award. So mathematically, for the folks that are on this call and contemplating talking to affordable developers and jurisdictions and housing authorities, the only way this works if we do it together, and to really sort of collaborate on the layer cake. That if it wasn't for the county's entitlement funds, no VHHP. If it wasn't for the HUD-VASH and the county and the housing authority's ability to stand up projects and be an affordable developer, it is that collaboration that really makes these projects happen. And we will not get successful whether you're talking about New York, California, Nebraska, and anyone who's struggling, in terms of, we know the veterans issue is national, but this is what it takes, and these partnerships are real and meaningful. Next slide, please. So just a brief, and I see our columns didn't line up there, but just a brief development sources for Victory Gardens. I think it's interesting. So I did back of the envelope math, Steve, after you gave us a number on your total sources. So I want to say we're about $560,000 a door for 48 units. We are mostly 1-bedrooms with I think 5 2-bedroom apartments, for the same reason that we have waiting lists, and we think the demand is generally for 1-bedrooms and studios. So we want to be judicious in the type of units we build. And again, of course, for partners that we're making operating guarantees, there's always the assumption that these apartments will be rented in full. So that is a necessity in standing up projects. So high level, the value of the donated land from San Joaquin County, which we're incredibly grateful for. We have some HCD funding around CASH, another state program, county CDBG and home loans. We're very fortunate for the $6.8 million of VHHP, which is, as Steve pointed out, is dedicated funding specifically for veterans programs. I would also say that comes with strings, that there is a substantial service commitment that is required by the state of California to stand up these projects. So we're very fortunate that the VA covers many of those with the wraparound services that come with VASH with case management. So it would not work without it. The 5 units for non-VASH eligible veterans, and just at a high level, I believe that's honorable to general for VASH, but if you have somebody in a circumstance that has less than honorable, and I don't want to step into the conversation in the sense that I believe everyone is deserving of help, and we want to serve people in our projects independent of discharge status. But for the 5 units that are regular rental assistance, the project has to bring in case management and services that are outside of the VASH bubble. So as a cost, as an operating cost, that's another understanding when you start to talk about these projects with VASH and additional case management, that everyone is going to need those services that present. So just sort of an operating aside, but it's just a reality. So a $27 million project, and there's about a $3.5 million capitalized operating subsidy reserve to get us to the 15-year initial operating period for this project. Next slide, please. So this kind of gives you sort of a back of the envelope operating that rental income, that's a tenant portion. The vets pay no more than 30% of their income. If their income is zero, they pay nothing. If they have income, they pay no more than 30%. So we estimate around a $500,000 rental income from the 48 units. Our expenses, day one are going to exceed that, but for not VHHP and the capitalized operating reserve. And I think candidly, we're being conservative in some of our costs. Yes, this is new construction, but a $35,000 maintenance budget, is predicated on the fact that there's reasonable care and people take care of their apartments. In crisis, sometimes, those numbers can go sideways. These are the realities of doing affordable development and having partners like cities, counties to say, look, if these projects still don't pencil, we obviously reserve the right to come back and say, look, this is the reality of dealing with vulnerable veterans, and everybody has to have some skin in the game that these projects pencil. To Steve's point around sort of a VASH plus, we agree that we have very, very dedicated and outstanding partners in VA caseworkers and case managers. Sometimes that's insufficient. Caseloads are big, there's geography involved. At some point, as an affordable owner, who's tasked in making commitments and operating these projects, I agree that maybe there could be a conversation where for people in critical need, that there could be a tranche of subsidy around operating that makes these projects pencil. And again, if we borrow money from people, these are loans, soft loans. At some point, I don't think no one's looking to be paid back everything, but sometimes there are mandatory contributions back to our partners at the state and feds for the loan of HUD entitlement funds and state of California funds. So there is a mandatory HCD payment on the VHHP loan. Next slide, please. A lot of partners. So I put this in that the Housing Authority is a co-developer. We have a private party developer. We have obviously the San Joaquin County that's treated us incredibly well. I'm very proud of the fact that we're doing 48 units. It's not San Francisco density. It's not Treasure Island density, but the density is decent for a more rural setting. But the county spun up 4.5 acres. We're using 2.5 in the first phase. So we're contemplating a remaining 2 acres. And what's really on my mind as I've listened to just some general conversations this week at this conference is, there's an affordability need for senior veterans. And I'm thinking that the remaining 2 acres could be a dedicated senior affordable that also has relationships. Thanks, Steve. I'm going to be in touch with you. Is that there's a nursing home. I don't think nursing homes, nursing beds were necessarily meant to be perpetual, right? So in some cases they may be, but for someone that comes in and then, struggles with housing stability, we think maybe some additional units in the orbit of the CBOC and the nursing, the community living center makes a lot of sense. So something else that's on our mind, and to our partners in the nonprofit world and housing authorities that are interested in helping solve this problem, along with HUD and this administration that I believe are forward thinking. there's a lot of need, but we're happy to be moving the needle forward a little bit in San Joaquin County. Life Steps, which does thousands of units in California around supportive housing, is our partner on the 5 units of non-VASH subsidy, and we're grateful to U.S. Bank and CREA as our construction and equity lenders. Next slide, please. I think that's it. So I can turn it back over to the panel. Thank you.
Guys, hi. All right, I'm back. So I think right now we're going to transition to a couple of minutes of discussion between the 3 of you. I know some of the things line up between your projects, and then you guys kind of went back and referenced things that Richard had mentioned in the beginning. So I want to give you guys a couple of minutes to just kind of discuss your experience, obviously both with your projects, and then also maybe some of the challenges you might see moving forward with things the way they are. And then we're going to wait for some comments and questions to come in from the audience. So I'm going to gather questions. I'll kind of hop off, and I'll be back with you guys in a couple minutes.
I was actually curious, Richard, you had mentioned that you're in discussions with the 2 secretaries about ending veteran homelessness, and this is sort of a hot button issue, and you're putting out there like, yep, and we need to build more affordable units for veterans in order to actually get there. Like we've kind of hit a bit of a wall with the efforts. So I'm curious to hear, like nobody's going to hold you to it, but like what is your thinking at the moment of like how we might do that, how we might get. So I hear that you've got the home funding, and that's terrific, but I also know like that home funding goes to jurisdictions who may or may not actually have ending veteran homelessness as their goal, right? And so how does HUD provide direction so that actually becomes real?
That's a great question, Stephen. And I'll say, I think we're looking at a number of different options. First, on the home dollars, I'll just say, we recognize that those home funds have gone to the home participating jurisdictions. Those are city and state housing departments for the most part. Then they may not be where the locus of efforts to end veteran homelessness lives, but one of the things that we're doing is looking at how we can engage state and local and county leaders once again around this effort and enlist their leadership. Some folks may recall the Mayor's Challenge on Veteran Homelessness, where the federal government enlisted the partnership of mayors and county leaders and governors to take greater leadership in that. I think we need to get back to that level of sort of an intergovernmental, all hands on deck approach. So more to come on that front. But where the name of the game has got to be collaboration. I think that both Stephen and you and Peter both spoke about that. We need to get the organizations the agencies that administer home funds locally together with efforts with housing authorities and as well as who have operating dollars, as well as with city, county, and state finance agencies to layer resources. Another thing we're looking at is just the HUD-VASH program and project basing. And we've heard there's challenges to the use of HUD-VASH in terms of project basing, but what we're seeing is that there's just lots of limits in the use of project basing. Most housing authorities have the ability to project base up to 20 to 30% of their vouchers in a project-based context. Very few housing authorities fully take up that option. A handful do, and so we want to understand better what's working for those housing authorities that have been able to use their project basing option. What's holding back other housing authorities from doing so? What are the things that HUD can do to sort of make that easier? Because we know I think both of you mentioned it's sort of a layer cake or a puzzle, right? You have to layer capital, multiple sources of capital. You also have to find operating services to keep the rents at a lower level, and you need funding for supportive services. And so putting all that together is challenging. So we're working on, how can our capital dollars through home, through trust fund dollars, how does the capital that our sister agency, the Department of Treasury, oversees, low-income housing tax credits, as well as I mentioned, the state and local relief funds. It's not a dedicated housing source, but states and cities have received $350 billion out of the American Rescue Plan for a variety of uses. That's a very flexible and useful source of funds. And then also how are we addressing operating and rental assistance needs that can be project-based. So Steve, I guess we're in the early stages of looking at all the different options of how we can do that, but also looking at ways that we can encourage the state and local agencies that administer federal resources to look at ways that they can secure, set aside, and incentivize the creation of housing that is dedicated to veterans who are exiting homelessness.
So I just wanted to, picking up on what you're saying, Richard, I participated in an effort called the 25 Cities Initiative that was related to the Mayor's Challenge, but a separate initiative. And we went through boot camps to analyze veteran homelessness in each of those 25 cities, and then set goals. There was a group called the Rapid Results Institute that was helping us do 100-day challenges. And some of that was a little bit artificial, if you will. Like we may or may not have reached the goal in 100 days, but it actually got us moving and thinking about, like, what do you need to do in order to hit a goal, as opposed to like, oh, let's end veteran homelessness. Well, that's not actually helpful. Like this morning in San Francisco, we've got 219 homeless veterans on our by name list. How do we dig down and actually address the needs of all those 219 veterans? In Alameda County, it's more like 600 people, which is what it was 4 years ago in San Francisco. So how do we set goals and really start a trajectory to hit our goals by X date, and who's doing what, and have some accountability? Without that, we don't, I have found in my life, which I'm getting older, right? Like we don't actually hit the goals, right? Like we want to, we have good intentions, but we don't get there. And so how do we plan as communities with some guidance, and I would say maybe even some stronger than guidance from HUD that says, let's do this, like let's get there. So I want to encourage perhaps a return not only to the Mayor's Challenge, but to things like the 25 Cities Initiative and the boot camps that I think actually were the core of how we got to a 50% reduction in veteran homelessness during the Obama administration.
That's great to hear, Stephen. That is exactly aligned with the way that we're thinking about this, and we're thinking about it at sort of the federal level in terms of how do we set ourselves goals that we can challenge ourselves with, and again, I think the flattening of progress on veteran homelessness over the last several years is not, I don't want to think it's because anything significantly changed in terms of our priorities, even in the prior administration or among federal staff. They were working just as hard at the staff level, and career staff, were working just as hard on ending veteran homelessness. What's different was that without having a clear North Star, having a clear set of goals, and the urgency that is set by leadership to say that we know there's longstanding challenges. We know things are hard. It's hard to find units on the private market. It's hard to build new housing. It's hard to ensure that we have enough adequate staffing within VA medical centers. All of these things are challenging. And people work to troubleshoot those. What makes a difference sometimes is really setting a time-bound goal that challenges ourselves to work with greater urgency, because and I think that's true in our personal lives, right? Those of us who want to eat better or lose weight or live healthier lives, those are all great and laudable goals, but unless we set some sort of time-limited, sort of time-bound goals for ourselves, like we often don't have the motivation to really make meaningful change. So a lot of what we're grappling with is how do we do that at the federal level? How do we also inspire that at the local level? And so great to hear, Stephen, that you've had a positive experience with those kinds of 100-day challenges in the past. We might not be doing 100-day challenges, but we certainly will be thinking about how do we set some goals for ourselves that we can kind of work towards. Look at the administration's efforts on COVID vaccinations. A lot of that has been about trying to set goals that are ambitious. How many shots can we get in arms in a certain number of days? And that you've seen great progress happen as a result of that.
So just to pile on two quick things, that I think there is a comp with the American Rescue Plan around the emergency housing vouchers that came out to housing authorities specifically for homelessness and the various categories around domestic violence, et cetera, that came with incentive money up front. I mean, there's no question that that's going to be, that's going to allow the penetration of those vouchers into a tough market. And I think to your point that I don't know that it is the issues lacking in North Star. We are also, subject to the real estate market and the crush pandemic notwithstanding, the type of development, the appetite in America for the types of homes that are being built, that typically, I know hand in hand is HUD's work around moving the affordable, moving the fair housing issue forward to say we need to have more multifamily, we need to have density in communities, and these are conversations that more communities are starting to have, especially on the West Coast. That I think eliminating single family zoning in a lot of communities may be a bridge too far, but I think there's a conversation that has to happen around multifamily. We used to use a word around naturally occurring affordable housing when multifamily properties start to age, there's acquisition, there's rehab. Those properties too are simply also difficult to acquire, which is why we're all going through the brain damage of doing new construction, because there simply isn't an opportunity to acquire as easily anymore. So I think all of those things are germane, and I think moving the issue for veterans, is part of a larger conversation about housing equity in America. But I think the emergency housing vouchers that are out to housing authorities as part of, and I believe it was 70,000 nationwide, that we, just for our community, we received 232. We've gotten 800 referrals. I'm certain that there are veterans in a portion of those numbers, but it is certainly nice to not to have to depend on anyone else to pay first and last month, to pay a signing bonus, to make sure that we're covering any application fees. So I think that model scales, and I believe it would also be appropriate for VASH. And you mentioned project basing and caps. That you're right. You have agencies that are not interested in project basing, and I think there should be some analysis as to why. But then I think also we bump into caps. So in some cases, we're active developers also repositioning public housing assets that also serve veterans, that we'd like to contemplate increasing the caps, where if you're in communities that your success rates for tenant-based VASH start to drop, that we have to be able to really have a conversation about project basing more. And we love the idea of giving people housing choice, but if the alternative is here's a unit that is good and serviceable and modern, but there has to be that transition to say these are dollars that could be used for bricks and sticks. So I do think that I would also request that we contemplating increasing caps for agencies that are active developers.
Great to hear, Peter. We're more than open to having those conversations with housing authorities around what we can do if they're already at their 30% of limit. What might there be flexibility? There's plenty of housing authorities who are nowhere near that, hitting that cap. The other thing I'll just say on the emergency housing vouchers, I'm glad to hear that. As much as those vouchers were created as part of the American Rescue Plan to respond to the immediate crisis of homelessness in a sort of emergency and kind of rescue context, there's a lot of good things about those vouchers that we're looking at, and may teach us about what makes vouchers work, such as what you mentioned, the additional administrative fees, the additional service fees that enable you to do the kind of engagement of landlords to pay those flexible upfront lease-up costs. We, in many ways, wish we had that for other voucher programs. But that is really a decision at congressional level. We are looking at what flexibilities we have through existing admin fee authorities to see if we can continue to do that. But ultimately, the decision rests with Congress as to whether they can provide those additional resources coupled with any new vouchers. I'll note that in the President's fiscal year 22 budget request to Congress, we've asked for 200,000 additional housing choice vouchers that we hope will have a preference for serving people experiencing homelessness. And we are hoping that some of the things that are the kind of nice features that you mentioned of the emergency housing vouchers could be built into those future vouchers, as well as perhaps explored in the future voucher program. So good to hear, Peter, that you feel like those are working for you in San Joaquin, and I think we certainly look forward to seeing if we could scale that kind of a approach. And
just candidly, even for VASH, that while the regular housing choice voucher program, I think that would be an astronomical number, but certainly I think for special needs vouchers, it might be contemplated. That's great. But thank you.
I want to just put in a plug also for a concept that has been put in place in San Francisco. Of course, we're on the left coast, and we have somewhat different values than most of the rest of the country. But City of San Francisco put in place what is called Proposition C, which is a tax on corporations making more than $50 million profit in the city. It is a tax above the $50 million. So they get $50 million profit off the bat, and then whatever they make above $50 million is taxed additionally. That's going to generate $350 million a year in San Francisco for housing and services to homeless people. And so it's a 100% dedicated to eradicating homelessness in our city. And while I caveats, I've already said them, but in other major cities, this is a potential source of funding, dedicated funding for ending homelessness. And it comes alongside the federal efforts that you're making, Richard, which we're very, very grateful for, to actually address homelessness in these larger cities where homelessness has been concentrated. Though Peter's also saying, like, hey, what about the more rural areas? We gotta address that there as well. And I would
You
dare
can send
say
us some money. I'm just
you
kidding.
don't have send some money, definitely. And so that's definitely, like, regional sharing might be a good idea at this point, because homelessness is a Bay Area problem. It's not a San Francisco problem. Like, people are actually getting on BART and moving around the Bay, and so like, if they're smart, they're doing that, right? Like, because there are resources scattered all around, and so we've seen that happen a lot with vets because we serve both San Francisco and Alameda County. They get on that under the Bay BART train, and they go back and forth regularly. So looking at regional solutions, not only the continuum of care, because that can be a little bit too narrow, right? We've got to actually think bigger for some of these areas, because in fact, like, hey, there's Silicon Valley to my south, which also has an awful lot of resource that could be dedicated to some of these things.
I think the strategy that you mentioned, Stephen, that San Francisco's doing is in a way a recognition of the fact that housing is and needs to be part of infrastructure, that you can't have economic growth without also thinking about housing. The greatest housing challenge is the rise in homelessness in California and in the West Coast and places like Seattle as well, and Denver, right? Like, these are places where there's been significant economic growth and additional population growth, but the housing has not kept up with that. And so you have this crunch in rural areas as well, though. I mean, that you have just, Peter, you mentioned density, right? And zoning issues where those kind of norms that are built into zoning codes are based on a kind of nostalgic idea about what communities look like, and yet they don't keep pace with where population changes are happening. And so I'm glad that we are having a conversation in the country about recognizing that you need to have housing creation coupled with economic growth. You can't do one without the other. And so we'll see what happens with this bipartisan negotiation around infrastructure. I do hope that whether or not housing is included in the final negotiated package, we are at least having the conversation about how housing needs to be part of infrastructure, and that we recognize that unless you invest in housing as your economy and your populations are changing, you are going to see rises in homelessness in the future unless we do something about that. So kudos to both of you for your fantastic work. I love seeing the pictures of your projects and about the really, in some ways it's amazing to see all the resources that you've aligned. In other ways, it's a little sad that it takes that many different resources to package together, but really phenomenal work on both of your parts. So I really I don't want this session to end without my conveying my appreciation on behalf of our secretary to both of you for the great work you're doing.
Can I make one quick comment too for the both of you related to Housing First? I know in a more purple county, it's always a constant discussion about Housing First, and for that we do need to have the dignity of housing and put the wraparound services to make people successful. So and Steve, to your point that there's a wide variety of opinions on homelessness in California, that the entire state isn't San Francisco, and there are it's just reality that we are constantly struck with this conversation that people either like the hobo lifestyle, that this is somehow a choice. This is not a choice, and there is dignity in especially veterans who serve this country deserve a place to call home. So I think that even, I'm very encouraged that I think that the discussion at the national level with this administration is that housing first does work, does make sense. So I think, advocates in this conference and on this call hopefully understand that when there's the narrative that you have to get people housing ready before they're ready, that's also a fruitless exercise in expenditure of money. That how can you medically stabilize somebody, how can you emotionally stabilize somebody if they don't have a place to live? So something we believe in, and we're constantly still, making that advocacy. But these resources, we couldn't be more grateful that we can make the argument that everybody is ready for housing with services.
Seems like it's a good time for Jasmine to come back on, and there you go.
Yes, I was just messaging. Let's move to audience questions. We've had a couple of comments come in, not so many questions, so we'll use them to prompt discussions and then see what else we get. Okay. So first question, what is the role of the VA Medical Center in your project's supportive services?
Depends on the source of funding. So the VA Medical Center for us, related to HUD-VASH, provides case management services to those veterans who are housed using the HUD-VASH operating subsidy. If it is not a HUD-VASH source, then if it's just private rent pay, or if it's what we call continuum of care rental subsidy, then SWORD sometimes gets not very much money, but sometimes gets a little bit of money to provide supportive services to those other populations. And I would advocate, and I saw in the chat, there was actually a comment on permanent supportive housing and the need to increase the supportive services for permanent supportive housing. So, and this ends up being not a national conversation, though I guess there could be guidance from HUD, but more of a local conversation about how do we spend our resources and what percentage of money do we need that's dedicated to supportive services. I would be remiss if I didn't say what I'm hearing all the time from internally to SWORD and all of my other nonprofit community-based organizations, that there's a mismatch between what government pays its employees and what government is willing to give to the nonprofits to pay our employees. In other words, if I am a case manager working for the VA, I make X. Let's just say it's in the $90,000 range. And if I am a case manager working at a nonprofit, I make, let's just say, in the $50,000 range. So I can't attract the same people that are working at the VA, and that's problematic. I need to be able to have equity of pay for many, many reasons, and calling out equity, right? Like, hey, we actually need to address some of the equity issues in our country, and having the nonprofits be able to pay at a similar level to government, I think would be a good start, good place to take a look and bring about some change.
In our case, we are looking to exploit the geography, that wasn't an accident, that there was land that was available, it had infrastructure that we didn't have to add as part of a project cost, and there is a facility that is mission aligned with our population. So I would say to communities that are contemplating projects, whether you're involved with an FQHC, the VA, I mean, any health provider that can be co-located or collaborate with related to permanent supportive housing, I think is a winner. Steve and I had a conversation briefly yesterday to say that, look, if people go into crisis, I'm saying to you, having that ability and quick access as an owner, an affordable owner, to have those supports and relationships, that those resources are readily available and not, half an hour. In this case, as it relates to the CBOC in San Joaquin County, there are vets that go 75 miles to Palo Alto. I mean, so that is the reason, that is being built here, and the advocates have made that possible. So we're just trying to sort of bootstrap that there's a facility, the geography is just going to work. So it wasn't an accident, and I would encourage other people to think about their, the healthcare and support needs that the VA will provide, and thinking about developing affordable housing that is adjacent.
think that's a great segue to this next question. So both of you guys referenced the locations of your property in your examples. And I'm wondering, without subsidy or some sort of local preference or right of first refusal, things like that, usually land and locating a place for the property is the hardest, most expensive part. So any ideas on what can be done locally or nationally to address this issue?
I'll just state quickly that the Board of Supervisors in San Joaquin County and the Stockton City Council came together at a joint meeting and pledged to end veterans homelessness in 5 years. People need the bully pulpit. I'm saying to you that made the land spin up much easier. That advocacy is critically important. So to me, and to again amplify what Richard and Steve said, I don't think there's any dilution of mission, but I think there has to be a clear priority and demanded of our electeds, and we couldn't be more proud of the fact that this is exactly what happened. Once that happened, hey, we have an idea. Let's do this, and it's amazing how many doors opened on that regard.
I mean, I would say that the land that we are using for our projects, the 2 projects that I mentioned, is City of San Francisco land, right? We paid basically nothing. Very, very little to get the land, and that's really in the Bay Area. That's really the only way to get land at this point. Going out and buying land on the private market is not possible, like literally not possible. So figuring out how to get government involved and get government to distribute the land appropriately to nonprofits that are working on these projects is I think the way. I do know that there is ability within the tax credits to acquire land, and so that may be the other. If you are in a place unlike the Bay Area where you can buy land, that could be used to purchase land.
Great. Okay. So I think a question for all 3 of you, not directed at any specific project. So somebody from the audience, I'm from an area with a $15,000 to $20,000 or 20,000 unit deficit of affordable housing. We're losing veterans who cannot wait for units and choose to relocate or return to other areas. We also see a 15 to 25% increase in rent, with an average income of $27,000 a year. Regarding housing equity, what are your thoughts on the 30% income threshold for affordable housing, especially with increased housing costs and limited availability? Congress set the 30% in 1981. Do you think that number should be shifted? What do you do in an area that cannot afford housing first?
I have thoughts. Richard, you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, to me, it's sad that that's a question that we even have to ask. I mean, 30%, right? There's no sort of magic to the Brooke rule with regard to 30%, but it is given the increased cost of living that many people who are low income experience. The fact that we're even asking them to pay 30% is astronomical. So the fact that we're seeing housing costs rise, and where we're asking questions about where it's framed as we need to ask just low income people to be able to pay more, to me that's a sad question to ask, and I think that just shows the limited stock. We have been living over the last several decades in the housing sector in a mindset of scarcity. There's been an assumption that we won't have the political will to invest in housing in any kind of scaled way, and so what we've seen is the cost of housing continue to rise, driven largely by things like population change, but largely because we just have not invested in this increasing the supply of affordable housing and housing in general. But I will say, to me, the question should not be how do we just ask households to pay more. And I understand that's coming from like how do we address the immediate needs of people. It is like let's
use my join the Zoom meeting, and so I'm not getting access to my join the Zoom meeting to enter with meet. Yeah. So I don't know what is that like it.
I'll try to keep talking, but just need to we need to make up for decades of significant disinvestment in housing, and that's I think how we can address the rising housing costs. And we need to think big. We need to think bold here. we have a chance with this administration and with the greater political support that we have in Congress to really make significant investment in housing. I think that's really where we should be focused, not on asking people who are already struggling to have to pay more of their income towards rent.
Sorry. And Peter, you may be able to opine more on this, but the concept of universal basic income, to me, actually is where we need to go in the United States to try and address some of these issues. Rather than trying to address it from a housing side, I think we need to address it from the fact that we need to address poverty and figure out a way, and we've got models from the pandemic of providing resources to people that allow them to live good lives. And, you know, it's not about that we should get rid of, you know, opinion, right? All of it's opinion, but it's not about that we need to get rid of the unemployment benefits that were provided during the pandemic so that people will be employed. It's that we need to pay more. Hello, we need to pay more. And figure out a way so that poverty can be there. Like, it's absurd. And so, like, yeah, okay, if we need to try and address that people only pay 20% of their income for housing, that's one way to get at it. But there are, I think, better ways. Peter, you're muted.
Sorry, I agree with Steve and Richard that, you know, asking the amount of money that could be raised by asking, you know, low-income families to pay more than 30% of their rent is a specious argument. It's not gonna be significant in moving numbers. And we had an experiment around UBI in Stockton. We had 13 program participants between public housing and housing choice vouchers, and the statistics were phenomenal. People did wonderful things with that money, and and our former mayor is doing this on a national level, mayors for universal income. And I agree, and I agree about minimum wage, and I agree that there's a lot of people that are working hard and are simply priced out of the market. So I think this is an honest conversation, to Richard's point, that the type of we are in a scarcity mindset. That if you do a subdivision and you release 100 lots, your prices are higher than if you release 1,000, because you automatically create competition in something that people want. And you know, if you hate homelessness, you have to love housing. And I think when we talk about at least in California, the motel and hotel conversion that's in the state budget, we talk about all of the commercial. I mean, if we have a candid conversation about malls and commercial properties that could be converted to affordable housing, that have infrastructure, have parking, all of these things that are important in getting these deals stood up. I think every community, independent of cost, can have an honest conversation around the assets that they have in the community. And even more candidly, everyone's affected by homelessness. So if the school kids are impacted, if, you know, the veterans are impacted, if clients, you know, behavioral health folks with mental disabilities, I mean, the fabric of communities are better if housing is not scarce. So I would argue that, you know, I think no one, you know, is under-resourced. This is simply a question of priorities. And I realize, you know, sometimes it's not a popular point of view, but I believe I can make an argument to anybody that there are assets that can be, you know, be used to solve this problem. And the blight of homelessness in this country, besides its incredible lack of dignity, is it does improve the quality of life. I mean, you're spending money on cleanups and public works, and you know, I laugh, just I'll leave you with this thought, that in between Victory Gardens and the Community Benefit Clinic is the county hospital. It's a county hospital. How many homeless people go into crisis and present in emergency departments where hundreds of thousands of dollars is spent to triage people who might die in 2 or 3 days? You could have bought them an apartment for $300,000 for people that present and get that type of health care. And I don't believe this is unique to San Joaquin County. So I believe, you know, there has to be an honest conversation around where our priorities are from a dollars and cents perspective.
Let me just add one more point. I 100% agree with that, Peter and Stephen. Like, you just, I think, spot on. I think the part of the challenge of why people believe that we can invest in housing is because they believe that homelessness and housing needs are this endless, bottomless pit of need. And I think, like, veteran homelessness, the progress that we've shown, we've cut it in half, right? So, from 75 to 80,000 in 2009 or 2010 down to now under 40,000 on any given day nationally. That just shows that if you invest in, we're not talking astronomical investments, but like significant resource investments in housing programs like HUD-VASH and SSVF, you can actually reduce veteran homelessness. You can reduce homelessness overall. We saw about a 10% decrease in homelessness overall from 2010 to 2016 without any significant new investments for families and individuals who are non-veterans. And so I think we have to dispel this idea that we're never going to solve homelessness. California, I know the feeling is always like there's this endless need and there's just always new people. But actually, the truth of the matter is that if you invest in those programs and you provide rental assistance, you can actually bring down the number of people experiencing homelessness. And that we have to stay true to that the data which shows that. And so to me, we have to stave off this idea that we can never have enough resources to solve these problems, and therefore we shouldn't even bother to try. I just reject that mentality.
All right. Yeah. So there was a couple of comments that came in, not in necessarily questions, but I'm going to try to reframe this into a question. So in areas that are facing housing crunch, that are already plagued with unaffordable rents and things like that, they are having little to no success working with landlords. They're not, I guess, enticed by the idea of serving veterans or serving families, you know. So what they're wondering is what else can they do on a local level to increase housing placements with existing resources, where landlords are not cooperative, and outside of trying to play the long game and work with your city, county, to build housing. So any ideas on what they can do, any resources they could leverage to place people currently?
You know, sorry, go ahead, Steve.
So we've, during the pandemic, we housed veterans using emergency housing dollars through supportive services for veteran families. And I just want to take a moment to say how amazing SSVF is in this whole mix of things. Richard mentioned it. I've been doing SSVF since the beginning in Philadelphia and here, and the dollars that are available for rapid rehousing and eviction prevention make a huge difference. So during the pandemic, we got a boatload of money for putting veterans into hotels so that they could shelter in place. And we have, as we come out of the pandemic, not there yet, but close, we are getting people out of those emergency hotels. And one of the aspects that has happened is that the hotel owners actually have become a resource. We have interacted with them throughout the pandemic. In our case, we kept many of them in business. They would have gone out of business without us. And so they owe us. And we've said to them, hey, what about converting your hotel rooms to SRO units? What about that? You've already got a bathroom in there. You put in a mini fridge and a microwave. Not the best, not a permanent housing solution, but a short-term housing solution. And we've now flipped from a daily rental to a monthly rental. And the people are on a lease. And that, I think, is a resource that's underutilized. So if you go to motel owners in your where you are, I'll bet you that they're not oversubscribed and that they would love to have some folks living in that facility. Again, you want to be careful about what does the facility look like, and does it meet basic building standards, because some of them don't. But hey, what a good resource. And so we've been able to convert some of our hotel rooms and our hotel owners into landlords.
I would just like to say this quickly, that to Richard's point, I reject the notion that communities can't solve this problem. But if you do not have resources that are current, if you don't have metrics that are getting people into housing as success, there are dollars. Those are community choices that I think I'm not suggesting dollars shouldn't go to recreation. I'm not suggesting that that infrastructure doesn't need to be improved in communities. But to Richard's point, housing has to be infrastructure. There is money available. Challenge people to find it. I don't accept the status quo. That's sort of my feeling, that it can be solved, and I believe that money can be repurposed. And candidly, if you think about police budgets, public works, counties that are doing services, the money's being spent anyway. I just think it's being spent incorrectly. So the housing stability will pay off ultimately.
Great. Okay. So to kind of round us out here, I'll ask a question related to COVID. You guys have talked about some of the funding that has already been dispersed, and then Richard, you touched on some of the funding that's kind of being dispersed as we speak. All of you, I think, have spoke to the idea of a federal set aside or preference. We've worked on a lot of products to encourage communities to get involved at a local level in some of the ways that you're speaking of, Peter, and find the money, seek it out, ask for preferences, ask for set asides, not only in housing and resource dollars like that, but to challenge budgets as they exist now too. So any ideas on, I guess, points or ways people can advocate in that way at the local level for increased shares of funding that exist in response to COVID to be spent in this way? And maybe a final comment, like wrapping us up on the climate with relation to COVID and resources that are available now.
I would say that there are planning processes that exist with continuums of care and with local VAs, and that you need to actually get active in those planning processes. And it can be very, very boring to sit at a planning meeting, right? But it's actually ends up being worth it if you are vocal. You can't be shy, in other words. You gotta go to these meetings and you gotta advocate specifically for what it is that you need. And you need to do your homework so that you know, like, yes, we need in order to end veteran homelessness in San Francisco and in Alameda County, we need a local set aside for veterans. No, absolutely, that's what we need. And we are advocating for that in San Francisco and starting to advocate for that in Alameda County. That is the only way. As Richard said at the beginning, and God bless you, Richard, for saying it, we know that we've kind of hit this, with SSVF and the resources that are there and the HUD-VASH, we've gotten as far as we can get. We now need to build some housing. There needs to be some housing that's there and ready to receive homeless veterans. And so in order to do that, you've got to get in there. And of course it takes, anywhere from 3 to 7 years to build an affordable housing project. That's the brain damage, right? It doesn't happen in a day. You gotta be committed, you gotta get in there. But I have met many of you who are veteran organizations. You're not shy. Go out and apply yourselves to the COC process. Go out and apply yourselves at the VA and raise your hand and raise your voice and say, yeah, this is what we need.
Just super quick from a timeline perspective, and I agree, many times it takes a long period of time, but shortly after our Board of Supervisors indicated they wanted to do a project, from the fall of 19, we applied for the state money once we had land and site control. We applied for funding in January of 2020 for VHHP, got it in the first round, got tax credits that January, July. This is like a rocket ride. We did this in 18 months. I'm saying put the layer cake in 18 months. It is possible if there's the political will to do it. It is absurd to think that this is not typical, but what I'm saying is it's possible. So I believe it's good to set the bar high. I think you can build housing. I think to Richard's point, if there is money in the infrastructure bill, I mean, not to grab that ring and sort of stand up a project. I think everyone has an opportunity to find money in communities that match state and federal resources, that these things are possible. So, I would encourage people to think, aggressively and not accept that, it can't be done here. It can be done everywhere.
I don't have much more to add to that other than, I guess 2 quick thoughts. One is, I think when COVID arrived, right, the message was stay safe by staying home. And yet there was a population of people in this country who had no ability to do so because they had no homes. And I think using that sort of rationale that when COVID arrived, should there have been more than 500,000 people living on our streets and in shelters who had to choose between sleeping 6 inches apart from somebody else, impossible to social distance, or having to sleep outside where they had no access to hygiene facilities? I think that should confront any sort of sort of conversations locally about like who has the most housing, urgent housing needs. That's one piece. The other is, to Peter and Steve's point, you know, housing is this, it's about opportunism, and it's about how do we creatively use resources to secure those set aside. So if you are somebody who works on HUD-VASH and you have access to those vouchers, and you have a housing authority who's willing to do some project basing, you can approach developers to say, hey, I know, you know, we could give you a stream of operating income in your building if we could bring some subsidies to your, and that's sort of way that you can sort of strike a deal. What Stephen mentioned about approaching hotel owners, right? That there's actually a business interest on their part to be able to convert their properties in a time of uncertainty in the tourism market into housing. And so I think it's a combination of you know, helping people understand the urgent needs of addressing homelessness, as well as being creative and entrepreneurial with how to use resources and ways to find those opportunities, because that's housing development is always about convenience and opportunities. As Peter mentioned, you happen to have a property, right? Like, how do you jump on that opportunity to create a development? So, back to you, Jasmine.
Great. Okay. Well said, you guys. I feel like that was a ton of information in this session. We've had lots of feedback, and I want to thank you guys again for taking the time out today to participate in today's session and share your stories and insights. If you guys have no final comments, I'm gonna go ahead and let everybody go. We'll see you guys back this afternoon at 3 p.m. for our next 2 sessions. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.